Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to a practical guide to guided analytics. This is where you'll learn how to make dashboards that just work. So dashboards that have composition and performance in perfect balance. Now, guided analytics is a Tableau design concept that's perfect for reducing that time to insight, reducing the possibility of information overload, as well as just improving performance of dashboards themselves. Now, before I get started, let me intro myself a little bit, as I'll be speaking to you for about 45 minutes. It'd help if you knew who I was. Now, my name's Adam. I'm a manager in the EMEA product consulting team based in London. And having worked directly with customers for a number of years, I've picked up a few tips and tricks on how to make dashboards more effective. So I'll hope to communicate some of those to you guys today. Now, a fun fact about me is that despite sounding somewhat American, I'm actually a really proud Englishman. Now, this is particularly weird as I've never spent any time living in the States, nor have I any American heritage. So I'm a bit of a freak. Now, if you'd like to know why, feel free to come ask me after the session. I'll tell you all about it. Also, I like to eat. Actually, I love to eat. Like, I really wish I was this guy right now. Now, the reason I'm sharing this gross picture with you guys right now is I want to share with you an example of how taking a guided analytics approach has helped me with the analysis that I do on a personal level. And that happens to be when I analyze my own eating habits. So let's take a look. So, what I've done for the past 3 years is use an application on my phone called MyFitnessPal. So quick show of hands, who's familiar or use the app MyFitnessPal? Nice, so a good majority, I'd say about 60–70%. But for those of you who aren't familiar with MyFitnessPal, it's essentially a calorie counter or a good way to just log the food that you've consumed over time. And that's what I've done for the past 3 years, not because I'm on any sort of plan per se, I just like the data. So I can put it into Tableau. I'm a bit of a nerd like that. And this is one of the dashboards that I created using that data. Now, the reason I put this dashboard together is because I wanted to answer some questions for myself, like how much am I eating on any given day? What are my typical peaks in terms of my meals in a day? What is the food that I eat in those meals? What's the micro and macro breakdown of that? And some general trends for how I eat. Now, this dashboard gives me all of that. It gives me my calories over time. It gives me a breakdown of my meals, my food, absolutely everything. And I have interactive filters that I can use to focus in on certain bits if I want. However, this dashboard isn't all that informative. It's got all the data points that I'll need to get the information, but it's just not communicating that very effectively. I'm not really sure where to start, and even though it's my own data and my own dashboard, it's a little overwhelming, and I'm sure it is to you guys too. So let's contrast that with a version of the same dashboard that utilizes the principles of guided analytics. And you'll be able to notice that everything is much more clear. It's sort of stripped back to the bare essentials that really need to be there to communicate what I wanted to convey. And so one first question I might have is, how much am I eating on any given day? And I've got the perfect visualization to answer that question. And actually, when I look at this time series, I notice that there's one specific day that sticks out a little in mind here, which is, if I zoom in, the 13th of February 2016. Now, you know I'm an Englishman because of the date format, right? 13 and then February. Now, on this day, I ate 6,648 calories, which is a pretty good effort by anybody's standards. Now, if we look a little closer, we can see that within the tooltip, there's a little call to action. Select a point to see exactly what I ate that day. Now, who wants to know what I actually ate on that day? Yeah, all right. So let's go ahead and make that selection and interactively drill down into my meals. So what you may have seen before in the tooltip was a similar view to this. You'll notice that I had a pretty sizable lunch. But let's start with what I actually ate for breakfast. So if we hover over, we can see that I had the breakfast of champions, French toast, which is about 500 calories. And then for lunch, I started things off with a tuna sandwich, then moved on to the good stuff, which was a pepperoni pizza. Then I had some, boneless chicken wings, which were good. And then I had some red velvet cake, a little bit of strawberries and cream ice cream, and just because it wasn't quite enough, another sandwich. I enjoyed myself. So what you may have gathered from that is that I was celebrating someone's birthday with the ice cream and cake and the copious amounts of food. But I didn't stop there. I went to TGI Fridays, had a cheeseburger. I had a strawberry daiquiri and a pina colada as well, because, we're celebrating. And on the way home, I swung by my local grocery store and grabbed a lemon meringue pie to have all by myself, which was amazing. Now, if I really want to know how naughty I was on this day, I can drill down further into a micronutrient level. So I can gauge really how many carbs, how much fat, and the rest of it I actually consumed when I ate that lemon meringue pie. And the news isn't great, frankly. But on the other hand, it's really great that I'm able to access this row-level data, this really granular level of data, in a very consumable way. So if I started with a crosstab with all this micro information per food, it would have been way too overwhelming. And even the approach that I took with the original dashboard, with a whole load of data points, it's still very overwhelming. So this drill down effect is a real cornerstone of the principle of guided analytics, because it helps you find those insights in a really consumable way. Now, just real quick, some further insights I found were that I tend to eat most during dinners on Fridays. And you can really learn a lot about a person if you look at this data, because you can see the food I typically eat. I eat a lot of chicken thighs when I cook for myself, which is interesting. And then you can see what a typical week looks like for me in terms of calories. So actually, that day was a bit of an outlier. Typically, I'm pretty well disciplined over the course of the week, although Fridays. And then things sort of maintain slightly higher on the weekend, but then I'm back to it on a Monday. Sound familiar? Yeah. So that is a personal example of how guided analytics has helped the analysis that I do. So what you saw on the initial dashboard was a classic example of just overcomplicating the composition of the dashboard to the detriment of general clarity as well as potentially performance of the dashboard. And in general, the greater the complexity of any visualization, then the longer or the more work Tableau has to do. So potentially the worse the performance as well. And what I've come to find over time working with customers is that actually this is a really common problem. And it's pretty understandable that it's a common problem, because with the increasing volumes of data we work with and the ease in which we can actually create complex visualizations, we all too often end up with dashboards like these. So dashboards that are either way too overwhelming to be helpful, or dashboards that just take too long to be of any use, and it really kills the end user experience. So the challenge that we have today isn't all that simple. It requires some practical advice, which is why this session is targeted towards an advanced audience. That said, if you feel like you're closer to the intermediate area of the spectrum, then fear not. The techniques we'll cover today will likely be familiar. Now, what I want to do is give you guys some practical techniques and some idea of how to combine them so that you guys can put together some dashboards that hold performance and composition in equal balance. So ultimately, we want to create dashboards that provide a clear and fast path to information rather than just an overload of data points. And that's where guided analytics can help. Now, the concept can be described and defined slightly differently depending on the context. But overall, I like to define it as a modular approach to creating intuitive, insightful, and scalable dashboards. So let's break that down into 3 core principles. So 1, dashboards should be intuitive. They should be simple enough for new users to immediately understand what the information is there to be had and how to actually operate the dashboard. 2, dashboards should be insightful. So they should prescribe key and relevant information at the forefront of it, but also allowing users to interactively drill down to pursue their own trains of thought and find those nuggets of insight that lie within deeper levels of the data. And 3, dashboards should be scalable. So they should provide the basis for good performance at all levels of analysis, regardless of data volumes at play. So, the 3 core principles of guided analytics. And the tips and techniques I'll cover today will speak directly to those principles. So, what I'm hoping is by the end of this session, you'll feel completely equipped with everything you'll need to know to make sure that your dashboards are more intuitive, more insightful, and more scalable. Now, as this is a practical guide, I'll apply these techniques over the course of the presentation because it is practical, to enhance another dashboard that I have that uses another fairly sizable data set. Now, just to introduce that data set real quick, it's around house purchases within my homeland in England. So if you've bought a house in England over the past 23 years, then this data set will have that house, the address, the date in which you bought it, how much you paid for it, what sort of house it was. So pretty interesting information. So huge potential to create a really insightful, very nosy dashboard. But equal potential to create something very complex, very confusing, very slow performing. And there's the other matter of the fact that there's 22 million rows in this data set as well, so it should hopefully provide a good simulation of what you might be using. Okay, so let's start with principle number 1, because starting with principle number 2 would just not be very intuitive. Now, the first tip I have for you pertains to dashboard composition, as indicated to my fun little icon in the bottom right there. So keep an eye out for that icon. It'll sort of point towards whether it's a tip that's mainly going to benefit the composition side of the equation or the performance side of things. So, design for the intended audience. It's common sense, but it's also the most commonly forgotten design consideration I'll mention today. So a significant portion of the dashboards that I see fail out in the field fail not because they weren't well put together, but because they just weren't really what the customer or the end user needed at the time. So this idea is all about being able to convey a relevant message for someone. And it's good to just remind ourselves about this because it's pretty easy to design something that's useful for ourselves, but to put together something that has lasting value and relevance to someone else requires a bit more consideration. So before you put together your dashboards, ask yourself, who am I designing this for? What is the intended use of this dashboard? Is it meant to be used by an analyst who needs to know the ins and outs of certain transactions, or is it for the C-level who only needs to know certain KPIs at a glance very quickly? And let's not forget where we might be consuming these dashboards. So if there's an appetite for consuming information on the go, then make use of Device Designer to make a beautiful mobile-ready version of your dashboard. Now, the answers to these questions you'll ask yourself in this phase will really help inform the composition of your dashboard. And so it's really important to dedicate time on this planning stage before deciding how to represent your message. Now, you may find as well that actually you have several messages that you want to convey, several stories, a lot of different topics that you want to be communicating within your charts. And it's very tempting to just cram all those charts together onto one consolidated space. But as we saw with my initial dashboard, that doesn't work so well because it just overwhelms rather than lets the end user absorb information. So really consider dashboard design as an iterative process where you start with a big squiggly mess of raw data, and then it's about processing those options and distilling down until you have a fine selection of only the most relevant visualizations that really best communicate your desired message. And when the message is refined, your dashboards will shine. Now, once you've honed that message, you can start thinking about the arrangement of your sheets. Now, the layout's important because it really helps facilitate the flow and intuition for the end user. And this flow is somewhat dictated by how we expect to read things. So take Western society, for example. Here we read from left to right, top to bottom. And so inherently, to someone's mind, you'll find that the top left and central areas of any dashboard will be inherently more emphasized, with the bottom right least emphasized. So by being aware of these known sweet spots, you can leverage them and ensure that you can prioritize your key views so that they make a bigger impact. Now, something that comes hand in hand with dashboard layout will be how to size your dashboard. Now, this is actually a fantastic opportunity to boost performance of your dashboard, as indicated by my little symbol in the bottom right. Now, once a viz is published to Tableau Server or Tableau Online, Tableau Server or Tableau Online will try to boost that rendering speed by reusing the cache that's being created. And actually, sometimes that cache is essentially tiles of your dashboard. So this is called the tile cache. And those tiles are images that make up what the dashboard will look like in the browser. Now, this tile cache can only be used, or is used most often, when the dimensions of your dashboard are fixed, are consistent. And this is unlikely to happen very often if your dashboards are set to automatic, which is something that I've seen used quite a lot. But by fixing the dimensions of your dashboards, you can utilize that tile cache more often and really help that initial load time for your dashboards when published. So a nice little quick win. Next up, utilize titles and tooltips to help clarify the message of your dashboard and really instruct users on how they should interact with the visualizations. So nothing fancy here, but again, something that's really underutilized in practice. So what I've seen, again, is things like no titles. I know this is something I've been guilty of in the past. Show of hands if you've got dashboards that are in production without a title. A few, but most of you not. That's great. And as well, I've also seen dashboards with just the default dashboard 1, which is not all that useful. I mean, imagine if I started my session with this, which would be confusing, or this, which would be even more confusing. So don't settle for the default. Add a title that actually makes sense, because it's a really great opportunity to frame the message of your dashboard. Now, what you can also do is use titles and subtitles for your sheets. So here what I've done is I've called out how you might want to interact with the sheets themselves, as well as framing what the sheet actually represents. Now, don't be afraid to call out the obvious here. It may seem like an obvious thing to say select a year to filter, but to an end user, nothing will be as obvious, especially if they're new to the dashboard. Now, similarly, you can apply this technique to titles of filters and parameters. Again, notice the verbiage, real call to action, select this thing so that you can filter, and it really helps encourage engagement for the end user. Now, tooltips. Tooltips are really, really great for just summarizing what each data point represents. But it's also a really great opportunity to add some supplementary information in there as well. So take this as an example. I've got a data point that represents 2017 and the fact that the average house price that year was 350,000 pounds. But I've also taken the opportunity to add in something a little bit extra. So the fact that that average price has increased by 12%. So adding in year-over-year growth is something that's going to be really useful for those end users, potentially. All right, so I've done a bit of theory. Time for a practical side of things. So let's switch back. All right, so here's a bit of a starter for 10. It's a dashboard that just connects to that data source that I described, that my land registry data with all those house purchases. And the first thing that I might want to do is, again, consider what the overall message is here. What is my audience? What do they want to know? What do I want to tell them? And in this case, what I want to describe is the steady increase of house prices in England. So I might call this the rise of house prices in England. All right, done. Now the next thing I want to do is just refine this down because it's pretty cluttered. I don't need all the detail, at least initially. So what I'll do is get rid of this map because it's causing some redundancy and I don't need to look at that level of detail. And if you want to know, it's just average price per postcode district. So I'll get rid of that. I only want to know the county's average prices at the moment. And what I'll do as well is get rid of this big crosstab. So this crosstab is the full detail, potentially all 22 million rows. And that's going to slow things right down, so I'll get rid of that. And lastly, I'll just get rid of my filter because there's a better way to filter. All right, so now I can start thinking about the arrangement of my sheets. So what I really want to do is emphasize this line chart because this is really going to emphasize my point here, the rise of house prices in England. And so what I'll do is just move the bar chart out of its way. And so the line chart is in that top left central area that's going to be more emphasized. In fact, I'll give it a bit more space. Now, a pro tip, if you weren't aware, is that when you've selected a sheet, it'll be outlined in gray. But if you want to find the container that that sheet lives within, you can double-click the header. And that blue outline is then the container that sheet lives within. And the reason that's good in this case is I can go ahead and move all three bar charts over to the area that I want them to be without dragging them each individually. All right, so next up, I need some titles for my sheets. So I'll just add in the title. I'll just adjust the default title slightly, price paid history, just to add some instruction on how a user might interact with this. So this doesn't have to be huge. I can use font to just make this a bit more discreet and so a bit more appealing on the eye. But the fact that this is here is going to be really useful for those end users. So select a year to filter. Now I'll apply the same thing on my map real quick. County map. And again, I'll just add some instruction on how this should be used. Select a county to filter. Okay. Zoom out. Now, alongside that, I've got some default tooltips describing what each point is, but I want to take the opportunity to really emphasize what's important within this tooltip, as well as adding some supplementary information. So I'll go ahead and dive into the sheet and click the tooltip to start modifying it. I think most people can recognize a year, so I'll get rid of the year label, but I'll keep the label for the measure and just put that underneath. And a lot of this is to taste, but the point is to be able to emphasize what's important. And what I think is important here is the actual average price. So I'll just use font size and color potentially to just emphasize that key piece of information. And on top of that, I'll just insert some of the supplementary information that I thought would be useful. In this case, year-over-year growth, which I'll insert there. I'll centralize it because I like to do that. and hit OK. And now I've got a tooltip that really picks out what's key about this particular data point, as well as providing some useful supplementary information as well. All right. Now, last little bits are to sort of adopt that quick win to boost performance a little bit. So currently, by default, I've got automatic sizing, but I want to make sure that the size is going to be consistent across views. So I'll just select fixed size. I can adjust that custom size, but I'm happy with this. And again, I might be aware that this dashboard is likely to be consumed on a mobile device. So I'll go ahead and add a mobile layout. I'll make this a phone layout, add layout, and just readjust the size of these to best fit the natural flow of how someone might use a mobile phone. So voila, a dashboard that's got the makings of being really intuitive and easy for a new end user to use for the first time. So the overarching thing to take away here is that simplicity is key to any intuitive dashboard. So in our pursuit to inform the masses of everything that they might want to know, it's really easy to make dashboards more and more complex. Now, designing an intuitive and instinctive experience for users of a dashboard takes a bit more thought. So take the necessary time to plan how you're going to approach the dashboard and how best to communicate the information effectively and as concisely as possible. All right, so principle number 2, dashboards should be insightful. So prescribing key information whilst still allowing the ability to interactively drill down. Now, one very effective way of prescribing that key information is through bands, BANs, or otherwise known as big-ass numbers. I didn't pick the name. They are typically a collection of KPIs that are often placed at the top of a dashboard. Now, research by the amazing Amy Alberts of Tableau has found that the human eye seems to gravitate towards these big-ass numbers. And you can see from the heat map here that the focus on the cluster of numbers at the top seems to corroborate this theory. We can't help but be captivated by big-ass numbers. And that's probably because they provide really good context for the rest of the dashboard, as well as providing a really great shortcut to the key information that you want to know instantly when you visit a dashboard. So, give people big-ass numbers, a really effective way to just state that key information that needs to be shared. Now, another technique for enriching the level of insight that someone might gain from a dashboard is to use Vision Tooltips. There was a lot of excitement last year when this feature was going to be released, and with good reason, because it's a really fantastic way of just encouraging engagement for a dashboard, as well as, again, being able to add supplementary information without actually adding a single mark on the initial view. So, well, and also additional clutter. So a really great way to just make things a bit more insightful. And they also look like a lot of fun, usually. Now, something that comes with a little less fanfare than Vision Tooltips is highlight actions. Now, this is something that I hadn't used a lot in the past, but something that's really grown on me. And what's great about highlight actions is you can call out where a data point fits across a dashboard. So if you look at this, for example, I'm hovering over some of the bars on the dashboard. Each bar represents county, if that's too small to see, apologies. And what the highlight action is doing is just calling out where that county is geographically. So I'm really able to contextualize that specific data point when I'm hovering over the bar chart and consider the wider impact of what I'm looking at. All right, so bands and highlight actions are really great for understanding key information at a glance, but the next level is to enable users to actually drill down beyond what's provided in the default view. Now, filter actions are perfect for this. They allow the users to explore and compare and view data in different perspectives and different angles, as well as different levels of the data in a very, very tactile way. Now, of course, there's another way to filter the data that exists in your dashboards, and that's by exposing the more traditional filters, like the ones we saw in my original dashboard. Now, I would recommend that you limit your use of these traditional filters because they tend to have an unwanted impact on performance. For every filter that exists on a dashboard, Tableau is going to have to run an additional query to both filter the data that comes into the dashboard, but also to provide the whole list of options that will exist within that filter, as well as decide how that filter will be formatted. Also, it takes up white space. So consider using filter actions instead of traditional filters. And just to emphasize that point again, let's play a quick game of Spot the Difference. Take a look at the two performance recordings here of my original dashboard and the iteration that makes use of those guided analytics principles. Now you'll notice that the version on the top for my initial dashboard takes a bit more time to compute the layout here. Now, this is Tableau determining how the views should be filtered, as well as taking time to actually populate the filters themselves. In addition, the filters are being computed sequentially, and this is because we're making use of show only relevant values. And what this means is one filter can only be determined, the makeup of that filter can only be determined once the makeup of the previous filter in the hierarchy is determined. So an example is if I had two filters, one of my meals, one of each and every food that I've eaten. If I only select lunch, then the bottom filter will only show the foods I've eaten during lunch. And the fact that this happens in this way means that it'll be computed sequentially and just elongate the total load time of your dashboards. So try to avoid using relevant values if you can. And again, try to use filter actions as a more interactive and more performant alternative if you can. Now, another advantage of filter actions is the ability to guide users through the levels of data that you have. Now, we can start from the highest level of aggregation and interactively drill down through those layers to reveal more and more of that detail that's going to be relevant. Now, this top-down approach is what I've found to be really the most consumable way of accessing that really deep level of data. And equally, by not exposing that row-level data in the initial view, it's really going to help performance of your dashboard on that initial render because it's not going to have to draw out each and every mark that represents potentially all 22 million rows that exist in your data set. Plus, that drill-down effect is pretty neat, and people like it, so try to do it. Now, if you want to try to do that, it makes use of filter actions as well as layout containers. So who feels like they're experts on layout containers? We have one hand. Please come down. No, I'm joking. Now, I'll go through how you might use containers a little bit in generating this drill-down effect, where you've got one sheet that expands and collapses based on whether you're interested in the data that pertains to it. And I also want to call out the item hierarchy menu when you're in that device designer, because it's a really, really great way of just identifying all the objects and the arrangement of those objects on your dashboard. And it just makes it easy to delete any redundant containers that you have with a right click. This is actually something I discovered recently, so I really wanted to share that. Okay, so it feels like time to do a bit more practical, to just pull those elements together. All right. So we want to provide some key information at a glance, so let's use those big-ass numbers. I'll just drag those to the very well-known spot at the top. All right, perfect. And now I want to add in some interactivity interactivity through those highlight actions that I talked about. So the ability to hover over some of my counties and call them out in my map. So what I'll do is I'll add a dashboard action. We've got a few options, but in this case, I'll go for the highlight action option. Now, it's good practice to always name your actions to what they're going to be doing, so highlight counties. And I want this to happen upon hovering over each bar. Now, a pro tip, if you've ever used filter actions, it can be somewhat annoying to have to deselect manually each and every sheet. But something you can do is actually to select one sheet and just hold down your button and drag down to do a multi-select and get rid of all of those selections. Now what I'll do is I'll get my bar charts to target my map. So my map exists there. And finally what I'll do is I'll target a specific field. So for one, by default, we'll be passing through all of these fields within our query when we're performing our highlight action, but I can actually make this a bit more efficient by just selecting what I want to be highlighting by, which is county, so just a bit of a smarter, more efficient way of putting in or asking Tableau to highlight. And now when I hover over my counties in the bar, it's called out in my map. And the significance of this is now I can appreciate that, yes, Greater London has had the most expensive houses on average over time, but actually the ones beneath are just surrounding areas. So I can sort of generalize to say that the Southeast is going to be pretty expensive. All right, so what I can do as well is enrich this view with further detail. So this means incorporating some of the views I actually deleted in the initial step, but I'll get to a point where we can hide them and only call upon them when they're relevant. So I'll start by just adding a container, because this will be important for sheets to expand and collapse, and I'll put my details table within this. Now you'll know as well that you've put something within a container when the container outline highlights itself in blue. If it's not highlighting in blue, then you've missed the container. Now you'll notice that this view is blank, and that's because what I've done is I've paused the querying using this button. So it currently says play, but by default it gives you the pause button as if you want to, inviting you to pause any querying. And the reason why I want to do that right now is because I don't want to have to wait 10 minutes for all 22 million rows to load while you guys look at me waiting to tell you guys a joke, which I have very limited jokes. All right, so I've paused that. Really useful if you're using large volumes of data. And I'll just drag in my district map so I can get a drill down view of the country and the average price per district. Okay, so now what I want to do is create that drill down effect so that things collapse away without causing this information overload, which looks like another filter action. So again, I'll add an action, and upon a selection, actually, first, let's call this something that makes sense. So I'll call this drill down to districts, and I'm going to use the county map to filter the district map. Now, another key step to this is to exclude all values. So what that's going to do is just hide all the marks of the district map, so the detailed map, because we're not interested. We've cleared the selection. But when we make a selection on the county map, that's when the district map will show some marks. Now we'll do the exact same thing for the table. So what I'll do is when I've got to a district level, so using the district map, that's when I want to take a look at the row level data. So again, upon a selection, exclude all values. When I've not made a selection, I'll call this drill down to detail. Hit OK. All right. So let's see this at work. Now, when I select a county, My map will filter to a specific county and give me a district breakdown. And when I clear my selection, my district map collapses away. Now, if I want to look at how that drill down effect works with the raw level data, then I can select a district. This is when my queries will stop being paused and just restart. And I get my full row level data, the full detail when I want. And when I don't want it, I'll clear my selection and it hides away. But it hasn't collapsed, probably because I'm not a real expert with containers yet. They're so difficult. But what's great is what you can do is select a sheet and select a container that that sheet lives within to find the container that that container is within. And then I can use that to drag it into the shared space here. So now when I select a district, the table will be at the top, but no matter. And I clear the selection, the table actually expands or collapses away and won't be there for Tableau to have to draw out all the marks and render. So that's drilling down. Last but not least, I'll just add a quick Vision tooltip onto my district map to make the selections really pop, but also to add in some supplementary information. I want to know the breakdown of different property types that are sold in this area. So I'll just add in a sheet, and this will be my property type sheet. So what this is telling me is that 31% of the houses sold in this specific area were detached houses. All right. So an insightful dashboard, or at least the makings of one, which provides the flexibility for users to drill down and find their own insights, but also provides some key information to gain just at a glance. All right, so essentially what we're doing here is leveraging Tableau's powerful filtering capabilities to move through the hierarchies of data in a human consumable way. So let's take time as a new example. We offer the users a guided experience to be able to drill down from the highest level of aggregation, so year, all the way down to every hour, which might be the row level within our data. And all the while we take those steps, we're maintaining context so we can actually consume the information that's there to be had. All right, so principle 3, dashboards should be scalable. So providing the good basis of good performance despite the level of analysis or the level of data used. Now, I'll start this section with a fundamental because it's really, really important, but I won't spend too much time on this because I think you guys at this point will understand the difference between a live and extract connection. But again, it's worth being cognizant of how you're connecting because that can really dictate whether your dashboard is a performant dashboard or something that happens to load very slowly. So just consider what best fits your scenario. It's also worth being aware of the implications of using custom SQL when you connect to data. Now, quick show of hands, who uses custom SQL in their dashboards today? Cool, all right. Now, generally, unless this is super duper critical, I would typically advise you not to use custom SQL. And let me tell you why. Consider this perfectly innocent bar chart. It happens to represent the average price per county, but that's not important. What's important is that it's a very reasonable bar chart to ask Tableau to draw. Now, what you'll see here are two ways in which Tableau will ask the source of data to draw this. So the query on the left is the query that's sent when using the native way of connecting to your data tables, and the query on the right is the query that's sent when using custom SQL. Now, don't let this scare you if you're not familiar with SQL. You don't need to be able to be proficient at all to appreciate that the query on the left is much shorter, and so likely to be more efficient and therefore more performant. Now, the difference between these two queries is essentially the nested select statement, which is actually the representation of the initial custom SQL query that you defined. And because this is essentially static code at this point, it will exist within each subsequent query that you ask Tableau to perform, and so potentially elongating render times and load times from that point onwards. So avoid custom SQL where possible. Now, one of the biggest blockers to deploying a performant dashboard is how to deal with big volumes of data. Now, some customers I've worked with have had the performance of their dashboards degrade because the data that underpins their dashboards has grown more and more and more. And some customers I've worked with have just not known how to get started when using a lot of data. Now, something that I've seen utilized to a lot of success is deploying dashboards that take a tiered approach and adopt this concept of a hot, warm, cold strategy, if you like. So consider the cold tier as your data lakes, for example, a lot of data, your most granular level. This could be data that exists in an unstructured way in your Hadoop clusters, for example, and typically not used for a lot of analysis because it's not primed for fast querying, it's primed for a lot of storage. Now, the warm tier refers to slightly more prepared data. This could be data that exists in relational databases, so data that you'd probably look to query a lot more frequently than a cold tier. And then you've got the hot tier, so an aggregated level of data, or data that's otherwise prepared for really fast and often analytical querying. So this could be, for example, your hyper extracts or data that's stored in Exasol, for example. Now, the basic idea of this tiered strategy is where the different visualizations on your dashboards are underpinned by the different levels of this framework, depending on what's needed, essentially. And so, for example, if you've got a simple bar chart, then you're unlikely to need a cold tier of storage to actually draw that bar chart because the number of marks aren't going to need every single row in your data. Now, let me talk through this in an example. So another simple chart, a line chart in this case, but don't let it fool you. This line chart is actually underpinned by 22 million rows, which isn't going to be all that necessary. So only using 23 marks here. Now, what you can do is aggregate the data that underpins that up to only the required level of detail. And you can do that through Tableau Prep. It's got a really great ability to aggregate your data up to the required level. But if you don't have Tableau Prep, you're missing out, and you should get it. But if you don't want to, you're in luck because Tableau Desktop has an inbuilt ability to create aggregated extracts that just roll up the data only to the point that's necessary, making it possible to consolidate 22 million rows all the way up to just 23 rows in this case. So now what lies beneath is just as simple as what you see up front and will take much less time to actually render. So we took a simple chart that was being underpinned by a very cold, very vast data source, and we rolled it up to a hot tier of storage, so something that's going to be a lot more performant. And when we're doing that, we're actually splitting out the data source to separate data sources. But what we don't want to do is sacrifice on the ability to filter through those levels. And what's great is Tableau provides the ability to do cross-data source filtering. And what's even better about that is it just looks like normal filter actions, which is really great. So let's go through that. All right, so our dashboard, that's very insightful, very intuitive, but you'll notice from the framing of each sheet that each sheet on this dashboard is currently underpinned by a cold tier of storage, so it's blue. It's going to be supported by all 22 million rows of data. Now, what I might want to do is roll up this sort of medium level of detail on this district map to a data source that's appropriate for that level of detail. Now, what I've done is I've created a Tableau prep flow that aggregates based on the district here, and just done some further cleansing, and I've output that into a workbook a separate workbook here. And I've also just copied out the map from my original dashboard. And what happens is it copies over the old data source along with it. Now, what I can do with this is just right-click the cold tier of storage that is used to draw out the district map and just replace this data source with the warm tier of data that I created in my prep flow. And as you can see, it only uses 59 rows as opposed to 22 million rows. So I'll just swap those out. You'll notice that nothing changed in my map because it's still being supported by the necessary rows of data. And what I can do is just copy that into my workbook. So I'll hit paste. And I'll just add this warm district map to the view and delete the cold one. So I can apply this principle across the rest of the dashboard. So rather than a warm tier of storage, now I want to look at making all the initial views that have to render the first time someone opens it to be supported by a hot tier of storage. Now for time, I'll just address the line chart and the map. And what I've done is I've just copied those out to, again, a separate workbook that has the line chart and the map. Now what I could do is just replace the data sources again, like I did for you guys before. But I want to show those of you who don't have that Tableau prep ability this option of being able to roll up the rows of data in an extract. Now this may take a moment because Tableau's trying to do this for a data set of 22 million rows. So now's the time for a joke, potentially. Who wants to hear a joke? All right. So a SQL query walks into a bar. The SQL query walks up to two tables in the bar and asks, "May I join you?" It's a good one. All right, I did have another one, but I won't subject you to it because things have loaded. Amazing. All right, here's the menu. And here's the option for you to just aggregate those rows up to only the dimensions visible or only the dimensions being used in your view. I can roll it up to the years as well and hide all unused columns. And when I hit extract, it'll just warn me that it may affect the level of aggregation I'm using in my calcs, which doesn't matter because I'm only interested in this level of aggregation anyway. Perfect. So what I can do now is just copy those sheets and paste them back into my original dashboard. Alrighty. So now what I'm doing is, in theory, I'm making sure that the initial views, each initial view that's being shown on initial render is going to be supported by a much smaller data set, a much more performant data set, while still being able to access the detail. Now that latter part requires some cross-data source filter actions. And again, the good news is that that looks like a regular action, which is amazing. So what I'll do is I'll create that drill down effect for the map. So again, the county map is going to filter the district map, but drill down upon a selection. And I'll do the same for the district map to drill down into the lowest level of granularity with the cold tier, in other words, the detailed table. And let's get that to show the details. Hit OK. All right. So now, when I select a county in my regular map, I get the county as expected, even though we're using two separate data sources of two different levels of aggregation. And now I can also use the district map to drill down into the lowest level of aggregation in a way that's really performant, really efficient, and really consumable. So still being able to access the full range of data whilst making sure that the initial load is as efficient as possible. Oh, I shouldn't have done that. Let's move on. All right. So that last piece was really just combining a thoughtful tiered data strategy with Tableau's powerful filtering capabilities. And by doing this, you can create the visualizations that you want using the volumes of data that you want in a smart, efficient way that ensures that you get the level of insight that you need whilst making sure your dashboards are going to be able to scale so that you can still drill down from the top level all the way down to the detail in that way that isn't going to overwhelm any of your users. All right, so let's recap. We've covered a lot of ground here, but now that you've seen the theoretical side and the practical side of adopting these guided analytical techniques, I hope you have the knowledge to be able to apply these techniques to your dashboards to create more intuitive, more insightful, and more scalable dashboards. Now, please let me know if this session was helpful for you. Otherwise, I'm happy to hang back for questions, and thanks so much for coming.